It's really a great honor to be here today. I've been looking forward to this. And we had a milestone yesterday, which is after less than 6 months, we were able to bring some important ideas and modeling to the MEC and have a deep discussion about the opportunities that are presented to you, the pilots of FedEx. Soon after the market crash in the famous tech bubble in 2000 and 2002, I had a bit of an epiphany. I had been working in the pension arena as a union representative for over 20 years at that point. I thought I knew something about pensions, and then everything changed. The pension system, both single employer, multi-employer, public sector plans, were hit by a dramatic drawdown in assets that eliminated, in some cases, 50 percentage points of funding. That's huge. And it made me reevaluate everything that I thought I knew about defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans. I started becoming very concerned that the financial damage that was done to our plans, the plans that cover 45 million American workers, were at risk. And that worse than that certain divisions could be created among generations of workers and retirees because of the funding damage that had been done. And then I recognized that this ongoing conversation or debate between between the advocates of defined benefit plans and the advocates of defined contribution plans, which had really become almost an ideological debate, was not having the proper conclusions and was in fact a valueless debate. It was not reaching conclusions that were helpful to taking us to a solution. And as a result, I started thinking about what could the solution be? If defined benefits were at risk and defined contributions were also not generating the retirement wealth that American workers needed, what can we do about that? And other things were coming into play. The maturing of the American workforce at the turn of the century. Many of the plans, the plan that you participate in, the ratio between active and inactive workers was moving to a 1-to-1 ratio, whereas previously that ratio had been 2 or 3 or 4 to 1, with active workers being able to support a smaller number of inactive workers. So we were having demographic issues that we were dealing with. People were living longer. It's a great thing. When you consider our parents' generation and our generation and the generation of your children and my children, it's astounding changes have taken place in terms of mortality and longevity. But from a retirement standpoint, the longer people live, the more costlier the plan. No matter if you're in a DB or a DC arrangement. If you're in a DC arrangement, you have to find a way of stretching those dollars out maybe 5 or 10 years longer than you assumed you would when you started in the plan 15 years ago. At that point, I was, in 2005, I was the Director of Negotiated Benefits for the United Food and Commercial Workers. And I went to the sitting president of the union as his expert on pensions and presented a pretty sobering reality of where we were at after the market crash. The president absorbed the information. I suggested to him that we had to look at different designs and think about renegotiating the pension deal that we had struck in the retail food industry and in the meatpacking industry, that were two main jurisdictions. Fortunately for me and the UFCW, he gave me the go-ahead to create a task force and to start studying the options available to us at that time. And I put together a team of experts because I didn't feel like I was the sole repository of all retirement wisdom, and I wanted to bring in some people to who I trusted and who I thought would bring value to the proposition. And so we brought in legal help, actuarial help, and investment experts to share their thoughts on where we could take this. And we set some boundaries and some goals and objectives. And one of the goals was that we had to find a design that satisfied all the stakeholders of the plan. It couldn't just be one-sided. If you don't have an employer-sponsored plan without an employer. So if the employer's not on board, you got a problem. And so we recognized that from the get-go. That was a major priority, that we had to build something attractive to the employer community. We had to satisfy the membership, and we had a moral obligation to protect the retirees. Maybe they didn't have a vote in ratification any longer, but they built the union, and we had a moral responsibility to protect their pensions. And the union. The union was a stakeholder in this. Its reputation was on the line, and we had to protect that reputation by doing the right thing, even if it involved some major restructuring of the plans. We had to generate the necessary retirement wealth that workers needed when they decide to step away from active work. And we had to manage the different risks that were buffeting the plans that we sponsored, whether it was investment risk or demographic risk. They had to be dealt with. And from the employer's standpoint, it was important to come to grips with funding volatility and contribution volatility. And then finally, I had mentioned a minute or two ago, we had to arrest this potential problem of intergenerational conflict. It was a necessity that we find a solution that worked for all generations of workers and retirees. We could not have them in conflict with one another. We could not have them necessarily subsidizing one another and one group get a better deal than another. That had to be fixed in one shape or form. Early in our research, we discovered that the community had ignored an existing design that had been out there since the 50s. And we rediscovered something called variable annuity plans. There was an IRS opinion letter. There were a couple existing plans out there. The Major League Baseball, it turns out, has had one of the oldest variable defined benefit plans in existence. And the actuary that I retained was actually, it turns out, was the actuary, became the actuary for the union side of Major League Baseball. We just rediscovered this design, and then we started working on customization, how to make this design work for us. So let me try to summarize what these variable plans do. They provide risk sharing between employees and employers. The idea is that you have a hurdle rate. When the assets of the plan outperform that benchmark hurdle rate, benefits can be improved. When assets underperform that hurdle rate, benefits can be adjusted down, and it's just a matter of how much improvement takes place. You could put limits on the improvements. You could put limits and floors on reductions. There's upside, there's downside. Structurally, the beauty of this approach is that it becomes self-adjusting. And as a result, the probability of generating unfunded liabilities, which are very problematic at the collective bargaining table because you have to pay for them, and they're very problematic from a financial standpoint for the employer. If you can mitigate the generation of that unfunded liability in such a way where you have an agreement based on equity and fairness between the parties, you might be getting somewhere. One of the crucial pieces of this is that it's still a defined benefit plan. At retirement, you receive a lifetime benefit, and it's protected from investment volatility. The other thought that we threw into the design was that we would take the present value of the assets and liabilities for each of your pensions at retirement, and we would either annuitize that with a AAA insurance carrier, or we would use a very special investment program called liability-driven investment or immunization, where we would create a bond portfolio that matched the benefit payments for your pension for the rest of your life. That was important because by taking that piece of liability off the balance sheet of the pension plan, you are removing leverage in the plan and making the plan more secure and safer on a going forward basis. And you're securing the retirees' benefit. So twofold: securing the retirees' benefit at the time of retirement, taking the leverage out of the plan, and making the plan better funded and more secure on a going forward basis. So here's a list of the various risks that we tried to mitigate. I'm not going to go through this list at the current time because it's just a bit of a repetition of what we just talked about. If you look at PBGC statistics, employers and unions have been adopting what are called hybrid plans, something like the variable plan, for the last 8 years. If you go back to 2001, less than 4% of plans were hybrid. But as of 2013, the last date that the PBGC provides the stats, that number is up to 21%. If you look at the number of people covered by these plans, almost 40% of single employer corporate plan participants are now covered by a hybrid plan. So there's something happening out there. It's an important trend. If you decide, and FedEx management decides that it's in everyone's best interest, this might be a direction that you want to follow as well. The world of pensions is changing at a rapid pace. There's no way of turning the clock back. In 1980, 2 years after I started in the labor movement, 37% of all private sector workers were covered by defined benefit plans. And unfortunately, over the intervening period of time, that number has dropped to under 14%. Of the defined benefit plans that are still covered by PBGC insurance, 40% of them are either soft or hard frozen, which means no new blood's coming into the plan. The new hires are going into a different plan. At the same time, because of the capital market volatility that we've seen, 2 dramatic historic market crashes since 2000, that has translated into a huge amount of funding and contribution volatility, which has just complicated the collective bargaining process between you and your employers. Just to give you a sense of that volatility, and this comes straight out of the PBGC data book. Pre-crash in 2000, the average plan was, single employer corporate plan was 144% funded. Fully funded, big surpluses. That evaporated in the crash. The crash was about 3 consecutive years of negative returns. And you could see that almost 60 percentage points disappeared. Just as plans recovered some of that and went back into full funding in 2008, the great financial crisis hit. Another 29 percentage points of funding evaporated literally in a 6-month period of time. Fourth quarter of 2008, first quarter of 2009. Corporate plans bottomed out at 80%, and then with the extraordinary monetary policy implemented by the Federal Reserve Bank, with interest rates going to the zero bound, that drove funding rates even lower. So the average plan now is only 74% funded. When you add on the fact that the PBGC went into crisis. So unfortunately, instead of the PBGC is on the same financial cycle as these DB plans. So the PBGC deficit ballooned out, and Congress, in its wisdom, started raising premiums. The PBGC, the agency itself, has no control over its premium setting. Congress sets the premiums. And there's a strange budgetary problem with PBGC premiums. They're considered revenue by the US government. So Congress loves it. Every time they raise it, at least on the books, it fills some of the deficit at the expense of the pension community, because the premiums are paid by the plans. Essentially, that comes out of your pockets. During this period of time, the flat rate contribution quadrupled. So there's 2 premiums. There's a flat rate paid per participant, every active, terminated, vested, and retiree. That increased from $19 per participant to $69. And then Congress created something called a variable rate premium, which is targeted at underfunded plans. And you pay the variable rate as for every $1,000 of underfunding, and that rate went from 9 to 34, and with a maximum of today of $517 per participant. So as of last year, if you look at the PBGC annual report, they received $6.3 billion in premiums from the plans that they insure, and that number is increasing. Let me step back for a second and talk about pension bargaining. In my long career, I've seen the evolution of pension bargaining moving outside the traditional labor relations relationship. And one of the reasons why that took place is because the Financial Accounting Standard Board promulgated rules for defined benefit pension plans that required employers to book unfunded liabilities on their balance sheet and their income statement. And this started in the late 80s. I was negotiating on behalf of the mine workers, and it was a revelation. I realized that the negotiations had gone all the way to the corporate headquarters of the company I was negotiating against, and that the CFO was on the line with the labor negotiator, telling him what and what not to do. I had never experienced that before, but that has now become a reality. So I know that your history of bargaining, maybe it's speculation on my part, but I think I could tell you with great confidence that the CFO and the treasurer of FedEx are in the back room somewhere watching everything that you do related to collective bargaining of your pension. The other thing that took place over the last decade was the historic drop in interest rates, and again, the market volatility of these two crashes. These plans now are mature, and they're highly sensitive to investment return and interest rates. That is really what is driving the funding of your plan. Recently, I did a webinar for the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. And I talked to about 30 mediators across the country through the webinar, and I did a lot of research in preparation for that webinar. And I came across a report from the Mercer company, who, by the way, is the actuary of your corporate DB plan. And I found it fascinating because they shared an opinion with their clients that we are at an inflection point, that things are going to start happening very rapidly in the pension world, that there will be opportunities to pre-fund existing liabilities, unfunded liabilities, and or outsource and bargain the risk away from their own plans by selling liabilities to interested insurance carriers. And they believe that the inflection point is actually just around the bend. They talked about the incentive to limit the PBGC premiums that we just discussed. They talked about the discussion that at some point will take place in Washington about reducing corporate taxes. They talked about the trillions, I think it's $2 trillion of profits that are stranded overseas that at some point might be brought back to the US and how that might be utilized. They talked about employers suffering from volatility fatigue. The other thing that employers and unions are suffering from is regulatory fatigue. And the number of laws that have been passed trying to address retrospectively, unfortunately, pension crises that are emerging in the economy as we speak today. And it's true. I mean, I deal with a lot of unions and corporations, and I hear this message on a regular basis. The insurance industry is very interested in this pension risk transfer business. Whether they have the capacity, I don't think they do, to really deal with the entire U.S. Pension assets under management. I mean, I don't think that's really possible, but they see business opportunities, and as you probably read, companies like Verizon, GE, GM have done buyouts where they've actually sold pieces and hunks of liability to these insurance carriers. This brings it back to why we're here today and what we've been doing for the last 6 months and what we might be doing for the next 6 months. Your leadership is doing something that I think needs to be done, which is to look out over the horizon and be proactive and put you in a stronger position to secure your retirement plans on a going forward basis. Again, it's my opinion that the timing of this project is just dead on. That having a conversation with FedEx management in the near future could pay off significant dividends to you as participants of the plan and as members of this union. This year, one of the first announcements in January was that FedEx was going to contribute $2 billion into their defined benefit plan. $1 billion of that, they went out and raised a debt offering. And they were able to sell the debt at between 3.3 and 4.4% interest on the bonds. Now, the prior year, they made a contribution of $726 million. FedEx is trying to manage their funding and accounting risk and manage the PBGC premium costs. That was, in my estimation, was the purpose of that large contribution. So any proposal that your union could make to FedEx that would reduce funding and contribution liability, volatility, and secure your pensions on a going forward basis has the makings of a win-win. It should be received well. I can't predict how FedEx management would take a concept from the union, but it should be received well, and your union and your leadership should, from my estimation, should receive a lot of praise for making this effort. I think there's a historic opportunity out there to restructure the plan in your best interests, keeping the moral obligation to the people before you, the retirees, and the people that are going to come after you. It's a great opportunity. I'm proud of the fact that I have the opportunity to work with you and act as an advisor, and I'm looking forward to the next steps that we can take. So thank you very much,